Welcome to this podcast of Sunday nights on ABC Local Radio. I hope you enjoyed the program. Hi there, and thanks for joining us. Well, institutional religion seems to be going out of fashion. The question is, can we do without it? Churches provide much of the social service and volunteer infrastructure of our community. Yes, even in these days. And this week, one of the largest, Anglicare, the welfare arm of the Anglican Church in Australia, is having its national conference in Hobart. And tonight, on Sunday night, we join them. In a few moments, we'll be joined by the Executive Director of Anglicare Australia, Kasey Chambers, along with Ian Carter from Western Australia and Peter Burke from South Australia, to discuss the challenges facing churches and social policy today, not just in the general community, but also in the parishes. It seems that whilst institutional religion is out of fashion, we can't do it without that which the churches provide, much of the social service and volunteer infrastructure of our community. And this week, one of the largest, Anglicare, the welfare arm of the Anglican Church in Australia, is having its national conference in Hobart. And it's good to welcome into our studios the Executive Director of Anglicare Australia, Kasey Chambers, along with Ian Carter, the CEO of Anglicare in Western Australia, and also a member of the Prime Minister's Council for Homelessness, and Peter Burke, Manager of Pastoral Care and Parish Development for Anglicare in South Australia. And Peter is also the facilitator of what's called the Parish Partnerships Network, and we'll find out a little more about that as our conversation goes on. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Kasey Chambers, first to you. How does Anglicare as an organisation relate to the Anglican Church?
Well, there's probably as many different answers to that as there are organisations. Each of the Anglicare organisations is independent and individual, so they're independent of each other.
Is that state-based?
No, we've actually got 40 members across the country. We also have associate members in the region internationally. And by a member, you'd mean an organisation, a local organisation. That's right. Yes. Now, all of them are locally based. They very much grew up in response to local need, and so many provide different services depending on what their local community needed. They come together in Anglicare Australia to give voice to national concerns, to get together to talk about issues, and really to bring a national face to that Anglicare. Their relationship with their diocese is quite different. So some of them are very, very close. In fact, we've been talking about this a lot today in terms of legal structure. Some of them aren't so close legally any longer. But certainly one of the other issues we've been talking about today is how acts and words are almost inseparable for organisations like Anglicare, and so that what is spoken about perhaps in the churches on Sundays is what's acted upon and done as acts by Anglicare organisations throughout the week.
Given that local structure and the fact that diocese by diocese, that's an area controlled by a bishop, for those unfamiliar with the language, the structure can be different and the connection with the diocese can be either loose or strong. How are things funded?
About a third of funding across the network comes from the federal government, about a third from state government, and about a third is raised in different ways. And each member organisation would have a slightly different profile there. But the parishes are huge supporters of the work, and there's a massive opportunity for Anglicare organisations in terms of that enormous goodwill that we're unable to unleash from within the parishes. And I certainly think Peter will be able to talk about some of that later. But it also gives the parishes a way into some of the work that they're looking to do as well.
So you're getting money coming from state and federal governments and from the parishes. Is there any sort of governance clauses that are common to all of them, which guarantee that if state and federal money is going to Anglicare, it's going on general community welfare projects and not being subsidising church-based activities?
Well, all of our agencies have got strong governance processes. There's just no choice about that these days. There might have been a little while ago, but the days when the government would give money to church agencies or any others because we're just good people are long gone. So
what a pity.
And I think we'd all be very happy that to be that accountable. The money that agencies raise themselves, they're still as accountable for. They're all come under auditing practices. They all come under the community standards in their own states. And, of course, most of our organisations are actually leading many of the accountability standards in terms of working around setting higher standards to care for vulnerable people, children, people with disabilities, newly arrived asylum seekers. So we're certainly not shying from that and would like to see ourselves as taking a leadership role in that kind of accountability.
So you'd have no problem with the proposed government having a look at the charitable sector and seeing that there's a sort of more transparent, overarching set of governance principles to the charitable sector?
Oh, I think there's two questions there, John. One is, would we have a problem if that's what's happening? And one is, to what extent that's what's being addressed currently. We'd certainly have no problem with greater transparency. We think we already have transparency. We've certainly made a lot of noise in the past about making sure that the accountability is appropriate, so that as I mentioned, where if we have total care for someone's life, we need to be very, very accountable. But where somebody's managing a tiny grant that's come as a one-off for a wheelbarrow for a community centre somewhere, then clearly nobody needs quite as much management of those type of grants. So it is about appropriateness as well.
Do you have concerns, and we might talk about this a little more in detail a little more later on, but do you have concerns that government sort of accountability can occasionally look like government policy management?
Look, there's two sides to that too. I strongly believe that while the government is being perhaps a little bit overzealous on managing contracts, the opportunity that's being missed there for the Australian public is having those people involved in communications and conversations about what the policy should look like and what those programs are doing well and what they're not perhaps doing as well. So I think where we have overzealous management of outputs and inputs on contracts, so there's a lost opportunity for the conversation that we might be having around evidence-based policy.
Yes, and we might come back to that later on. But let me continue with this link to government relations for a moment. With Ian Carter, you're somebody who's a member of the Prime Minister's Council for Homelessness, and the PM, as a result of initiatives in the Rudd era, set up a number of bodies looking at things as sort of community building relations all over the place. To what extent are these things just a talk fest, the Council for Homelessness, or to what extent is Anglicare genuinely able to contribute to the development of government policy or have an input to government policy through things like these councils?
Well, certainly I think the Prime Minister's Council on Homelessness has been a very successful vehicle. And I think when you look at what happened in things like the White Paper on Homelessness, we've actually had in the last 3 or 4 years unprecedented investment in homelessness, the biggest investment in 25 years. And, because of the global financial crisis, the money that was put into social housing then was like a double whammy. So we actually had a significant investment in new homelessness funding, significant investment in social housing. And if you look at any graphs of how it's been over the last 25 years, it's like a huge jump on the radar screen. What we're now calling for is that money needs to be maintained and we need to be looking at it. But it's quite clear that the White Paper processes and the role of the Prime Minister's Council on Homelessness has had a significant influence on the shaping of that policy and program agenda and about what's currently being thought at the moment. And I think you're exactly right in focusing on that as an issue, because there's no point in us just being service deliverers. And I think as church-based agencies, we don't just want to be there as the hold a contract, get the money, deliver the service. We are there for lots of reasons, and we are, as faith-based, faith-inspired organisations, issues around social justice advocacy, speaking out on behalf of our clients, raising major issues in the community are critical parts of our agenda, as well as quality service delivery.
Yes, it becomes a very, very difficult road to hoe, particularly, Peter Burke, if I could come to you, when quite often it seems that where the policy departments of a church or a church agency may have a clear view that they wish to advocate with government, say on the issue of homelessness or on social inclusion issues generally, that's a different thing to views that may exist in the pews.
To some extent, but I think one of the things that Anglicare organisations demonstrate is that our advocacy positions are grounded in practice. And a lot of that practice happens through the work of paid professionals. Some of it happens through skilled volunteers, and some of it happens through people in parishes. So one of the things that I'm involved in, together with colleagues across the nation, is developing a sense that local congregations can do something in their local community which complements the work that Anglicare organisations do through paid professional programs where we are fulfilling government-funded contracts. And so in combination, what we're doing is we're actually involved in a great enterprise of community building across the board. And one of the things I find with parishes is that the assumed conservatism of people in parishes is very quickly broken down once they have a real live experience of people who are doing it tough. And one of the things I've discovered, for example, in Adelaide is that there are quite a number of parishes that have little parish pantries. They're giving out emergency relief informally on a weekend or of an evening when most of the agencies are closed, and they're doing it off their own back, and they're doing it because they see a need and they want to respond. So we want to sort of capture this energy and develop this sense that we're all doing this together through different means, including the parish, the local parish as a site, not only for worship and fellowship, but also for care and community.
I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but Kasey Chambers, let me pull you back to an issue that takes us here both to the interface between who the churches are and what their agencies represent and what governments and other organisations may want of them. And it takes us to a tension that's spoken of much in church circles, but perhaps understood least by the public, and that's the tension between charity and justice. Lots of theological discussions go on about this issue, but it's one that's fundamental to churches and social policy. As many governments would be quite happy to divest themselves of responsibility for a lot of social welfare and pass it back to the churches. You hear it commented on in Britain at the moment with things like the Big Society program. And it's seen that the churches are good at dispensing charity, and some churches have welcomed this role for themselves. Others say, no, our business is to ensure that society itself acts justly, and this is not simply a matter of us dispensing charity as to patch the holes in the social safety net. Is that a tension you constantly have to deal with?
I think we work we work at both ends of that. Often it's typified by the analogy of the fence at the top of the cliff and the ambulance at the bottom. Certainly we work to transform the nature of society and to challenge the unjust structures in society through policy, through community attitudes. But we do also work to transform the lives of individuals, and our services work with many hundreds of thousands of clients every year to do that. Certainly it's more our role to be talking about policy and to be looking at how we do transform a society, how we work with policy leaders, how we work with our political leaders, and how we change also community attitudes, which over recent years do seem to have been hardening towards many of the people whom we serve.
John, can I jump in there? And I think one of the things about the word charity that always worries me is the original derivation of the word charity was love, but it's almost been now countervailed into this word around a handout or something.
It's crumbs from the rich man's table stuff.
Exactly, and yet its absolute essence of the church is about this issue about love, and all the connections go back to that. And you're right that juxtaposition of charity and service delivery and advocacy is a really difficult road. But it also, the plurality of the church and all of its structures around the country actually attend to those matters. There are some organisations within the Anglican Church who are purely about issues to do with public affairs, social justice and other issues. There are some organisations who do fantastic service delivery in maybe niche areas, and then there are other organisations who do both the advocacy and the frontline service delivery. And as Kasey said, we're all structured different way. I've got an incorporated association with a separate board of directors, separate to the church. There are other parts that sit under the church. But the plurality of the structures and the diversity of structures across the Anglican Church is actually one of the rich tapestries that we've got. And when we come together as Anglicare Australia, it's really a very powerful forum to bring that all together.
And I think it is one of the differences and one of the deeply meaningful things about working for a network like Anglicare is that we're not just service deliverers. So while the service might be delivered, we have a calling and a need and an obligation to then tell that story of those people, of those communities, and work for change at the societal level.
Peter Burke, tell us a little bit about the Parish Partnerships Network and what you do and how that's functioning.
One of the things that actually happens through parish partnerships is that the resources and energy of an Anglicare organisation plus one or more parishes comes together to actually provide the bridge between what you're describing as charity and justice, and that is community building. Now, community building is something that Anglicare organisations do per se anyway, but to actually look at a parish and say a parish is a community of faith and action, what wants to do something in its local community. Let me give you an example. In the parish of St Bede's Semaphore in Adelaide, there is a 2-morning-a-week drop-in centre for people living in boarding houses. It's been going for a long time, and it's supported now by an Anglicare staff member, several volunteers, including volunteers from the local community and the parish. And they basically provide a place where people living in boarding houses can come together, can feel valued, can receive a nourishing breakfast, can actually start the day in a positive way. It's a small thing, but it's that kind of infrastructure building that actually helps the community to be strong. And there are many small examples of this right around the country, of local congregations doing things which might be once a month, might be once a week, might be twice a week, might be every day. But they're things where local people in local communities are responding to need. So the network gets together twice a year, and we get people from most states in Australia, and we talk about the work that we're doing and the way we're developing that sense of partnership between professionals and volunteers, between clergy and laity, between church and community, and it seems to be working.
Would that have some element within it too of Christian teaching? That is, why you're doing things in terms of the way you interpret the Bible and that sort of thing?
I think that's a relational thing. I think that one of the things that we're sort of saying within an Anglicare context is that we meet every need, and if a need is spiritual, we'll have a go at meeting that too. I mean, I don't think we can put a firewall up and say we don't meet spiritual needs, but we need to wait for the moment where a person reveals that need and says they want that need met.
Yeah, I'm just looking at similar models to what you're talking about. What immediately flashes to mind is the St Vincent de Paul model in the Catholic Church, where groups in local churches meet as St Vinny support groups, sort of things, and have a definite connection then into the structure of St Vincent de Paul as it operates throughout the church.
Yeah, I think in the Anglican system it's much more diverse and operates differently in different places. But I think there's a similar kind of spirit where people are saying in parishes that it's no longer adequate for us to just be places of worship and fellowship with each other. We've actually got to have some kind of community connection in order to validate ourselves and in order to be authentically part of the community. And I think that's got something to do with the apparent failure of the church these days, the sense of irrelevancy, that churches have become isolated from their own communities. And I think partnerships with Anglicare is a really good way of reconnecting with community and doing it through an organisation which is credible, which is professional, and which can provide some really good direction as to how to connect positively with communities rather than just go out on your own.
If somebody wants to become part of this, how would they do it?
Well, I think the best way is to go to your local parish, although one of the things is that not every parish yet is involved in this, but we're involved in a movement, and a movement takes time. There are lots more parishes now that are actively involved than were 10, 20 years ago. We did a survey in the Diocese of Adelaide and found that of the 67 parishes in the Diocese of Adelaide, there were 61 parishes that were doing something in their community to meet social needs, which is phenomenal. But a lot of this is not known. Anglicans are often the quiet achievers at a parish level. We actually just get on and do it, and it's often small, but it's there. So try your local parish and see what's happening.
And could, if the local parish, if there's somebody active in a local parish, and they want to say, look, we need to be part of the formal parish partnerships network, and sort of beat the local vicar over the head. I mean, can they do that?
Well,
what's the routine?
We tend to be a little bit informal here. Yeah, it's not a structured system. Right. That's imposed. It really is more like a movement within the churches. I mean, my beginning in this movement was working as a parish social worker in St Mark's, Fitzroy in 1980, and at that stage, the idea of a parish doing local community work was pretty unheard of, although it had been something that was happening in the 30s through the Depression and in subsequent years, but we'd sort of lost the way. And I think one of the things about being an Anglicare organisation today is that we have that opportunity to blend that professional care with something that's local and something that is a genuine expression of what a local church is trying to be.
Kasey, I guess I have to come back and ask you, to what extent does Anglicare National, under your stewardship, see this sort of grassroots development as critical to the future of Anglicare and indeed to the church?
I think it's fundamental. I think it's where a lot of our work starts and ends. As Peter says, there's a continuum between volunteer and professional in there. It's also where we enable members of the community to reach out. Sometimes those members of that community are quite shy to reach out. And in terms of transforming the society like we spoke about earlier, breaking down some of those barriers between groups which often dichotomise, between people who go to church and people who perhaps don't, between people who have and people who need. So I think it's absolutely fundamental. I think it's really exciting as well. It's not perhaps the most publicised. I know as when I've been a CEO of an organisation like this myself in the past, you jump on the desk and hollow and hoop when you get a multi-million-dollar contract. But in actual fact, I think there should be just as many celebrations for this type of work, because it's also the type of work that will not only sustain the Anglicare organisations professionally, it does keep everybody in touch, and it is the work that will actually sustain this type of network.
Yes, and I guess for many people they would see it as part of the necessary renewal of the church in society.
I think so. I mean, I think we have had a lot of conversation in the last couple of years about Anglicares and the work of Anglicare member as fresh expressions of ministry, and certainly there will be many people in our network who see that they're not only doing their day-to-day work, caring for individuals, exercising their professional skills, but are also fulfilling that call to be doing things to turn around lives of people, to engage with people, and to transform things.
One of the difficulties is the tension these days, different from, say, in the 1930s when neighbours were out of work and you could help the neighbour through the church and the other communities, is the extent of professionalisation these days. And there seems to be so many barriers against volunteers getting involved in anything, because the moment you register volunteers, you've got to scrutiny checks, you've got to do all sorts of qualification checks, let alone those about working with kids and other things. It almost seems as though the barriers are too intimidating to be believed, Peter. How do you get over that sort of stuff?
I don't think you do get over it. You just do it. I mean, if you're a member of a church these days and you want to be a leader in the church, you have to get authorisation. Through the Anglican Church, we've gone through some very painful times around the whole issue of sexual abuse, and the response to that has been that people who are in authorised ministry today are screened and trained and authorised for what they do. So it doesn't really make a difference whether you're working through your local parish on a Sunday morning at worship, working with children, or whether you're doing it through a volunteer organisation such as Anglicare during the week. It's the same kind of standards that has to apply, and we just have to get on with it and say, well, we're determined to make sure that the quality of what we do is very good.
You're on Sunday night on ABC Radio Around Australia. John Cleary with you. We're talking about Anglicare. They're having their national conference in Hobart this week, and in the studio we're joined by the Executive Director of Anglicare Australia, Kasey Chambers, along with Ian Carter, the CEO of Anglicare in Western Australia and also a member of the Prime Minister's Council for Homelessness, and Peter Burke, Manager of Pastoral Care and Parish Development for Anglicare in South Australia. And Peter is the facilitator of what's called the Parish Partnerships Network, something you might care to find out about in your local community. Ian Carter, let me come to you. We've mentioned briefly the PM's Council for Homelessness and the role of these consultative bodies. Homelessness is one of the priority areas of the Rudd government. It seems to have been followed up by the subsequent ministers under the Prime Ministership of Julia Gillard. But in the general area, a number of churches have been thinking twice about the whole area of government contracts, and it comes to do with this. I mean, it's generally called transparency and accountability, but quite often it gets down to a rhetoric that says, oh, look, we're going to get the churches to do this because churches can respond to local situations much more willingly. They can individually case manage and look after people in ways that will go the second mile. And they say all that and they deliver the money, and then they impose criteria for management of the money which virtually prevent the church doing any of those value-added activities. Now, that was particularly a criticism over Employment Plus. The Salvo's got the Employment Plus contract, and they found some of the restrictions placed on them were quite tight. Now, how have you gone with the sorts of things you're doing, and is the atmosphere changing in the relationships with government and community agencies?
Look, I think certainly the rhetoric is there at a federal government level. I've got to say, I'm one of the people who is concerned about the proposed Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission. Is it going to be yet another layer of accountability and red tape, particularly given that, I come from Western Australia, which doesn't cede many things to the Commonwealth. And, if we're in a situation where we may well find ourselves having to report to federal structures around transparency and accountability and then continuing to do the same thing at state government level, those kind of things raise concerns for us. I mean, on any reading of a level of transparency and accountability, there is no doubt that the charitable community sector in Australia is more transparent and accountable than any other sector in this country. That's absolutely clear. But quite rightly, I suppose, people remain concerned about this and that, and this is public money. But I always find it interesting that people talk about public money, but they'll give money to a major private contractor to build a bridge or build a road, but they won't stick the level of red tape that's imposed on us. Now, I'm sure some private companies would disagree with me, but if you want to come and follow some of my contracts around and their level of stuff that we've got to put back in, there are government agencies who've made an art form out of this, and it really has become a process where this has got to be in by this time and followed by that, and this has got to be delivered this way. And there's a program I've got at the moment where, I mean, we're a very large agency in WA. We operate right across the state, and it's a small little program, but this government agency will not let a particular electronic report go out unless it's authorised by the CEO. Now, this contract's worth like $90,000 or $100,000 is a very small program in my agency, and it's normally signed off by a chief financial officer or something. But I have to get this authorisation. I've got someone walks in, and I've got to get this thing. I've got to put in a password, a counter password, and then log it into their system. And you just go, this is unnecessary. We don't need to be doing this kind of stuff. And there are programs like Job Services Australia and others, which many people have argued are similarly over accountable in terms of the delivery of public money. churches are very, as you said, good at delivering local solutions. We need to be freed up to do it. We don't need anything more added on to what we're doing. We're very nimble, very capable at the local level to deliver services.
It's something to do with the tyranny of what are called KPIs, key performance indicators. And so often, and this doesn't just apply to the charitable section, people talk about it in the university sector or in other sectors. That is, what gets measured in KPIs are throughput indicators that tend to relate to how much money was spent and how many people were throughput in what period of time, none of which goes to quality.
No, it's exactly right. And it's interesting, we're running a big program at the moment in Anglicare WA using a framework called results-based accountability, where every one of our 57 different service types that we've got, we're running through this program because we want to focus on the outcome. We don't want to, as you say, how many beds were occupied for how many nights by what kind of client. We actually want to know where we've done something about doing something about the homelessness and whether we've actually moved someone on into affordable quality accommodation and put them into a sustainable lifestyle for the rest of their lives. That's the important outcome that we should be focusing on, not how many beds were occupied by how many nights. And this is this argument about, most of us want to be outcomes focused and evidence based. And given our druthers, we could do lots of high-level accountability. And you see the annual reports of most Anglicare agencies. They're outstanding documents talking about what we're doing, and we're all separately and independently audited and all that kind of stuff. We're really happy to be transparent and accountable. But at the moment, for me, when I look on the radar screen, I don't have great hope for the future.
Kasey Chambers, I guess this is one of those issues which you see occurring across the board. Is there any evidence you've got that government departments are becoming more attuned to that? One tends to get the feeling that whilst individual operators in the bureaucracy may be attuned to it, you have the overall rod of iron imposed by Treasury, and Treasury bureaucrats are generally very hard-nosed when it comes to this stuff.
Look, I think it's cultural. I think it's organisational culture. I think that there are changes afoot, but I think it will take not only change in culture, but that will need to be managed and reinforced. We have this conversation quite a lot with senior bureaucrats. There is, for example, a compact between the Australian federal government and the charitable sector. And in recent times, each department has created a champion for that compact at a deputy secretary level. Now, I have been meeting with a few of those over the last few months. They, I think, are getting it, but then there are many, many people under them to get it. And I think what happens is, there is a culture of risk aversion, and whatever happens, it bounces back. So we really need to be getting some understanding in the areas of the public service that do sign off on these things. One of the things that alarms me is the real lack of anybody that's worked in both sectors. There's very few of us, very few people who've worked in both sectors. And I also see that as one of the cures, because there is a non-knowledge about our sector and what we're up to within the bureaucracy, and likewise the other way around. And we do speak different languages. Speaking a different language isn't difficult when it's French and English, but when you both think you're speaking the same language, it's quite difficult.
Yes. Could I just add too, from a pastoral care perspective, when it comes to pastoral care of staff, that staff who are committed professionals who really want to get on with the job find it inordinately frustrating to have to spend more and more of their time at their desks fulfilling accountability requirements, applying for short-term funding contracts that may last 2 years. They've just got into one and they've got to apply again. And it really is something that comes to me quite often from staff saying how much they would like to be able to just get on with a job of caring for people and providing the quality service and transforming lives, but they can't because the extent of accountability is getting greater and greater.
One other thing I'd like to ask before moving off from this area of government relations, and that's the area of competitive tendering. A number of churches have said that, look, this might have been a good idea initially to sort of weed out the the problems, but it's becoming destructive as different agencies, all well-intentioned, strip back the quality of their service to come in with the lowest tender.
I think we're all nodding and nodding at each other, nodding at ourselves and nodding at you there, John. Look, I think that there are moves afoot to improve some of this work. We're having conversations at senior government levels about ensuring that that bureaucrats are able to recognise some of the things that agencies need to be putting in there, things around governance, things around IT, things around staff development, because it's always very tempting for particularly smaller agencies to cut those out, to make themselves look a more attractive option. We really need to be saying that that's not acceptable. So again, that there's some culture change within the bureaucracies that needs to happen there.
And John, I need to say that in WA, it's pretty interesting. There's been a process initiated by the state government. It's called the Economic Audit Committee report called Putting the People First came down. It was an initiative that Colin Barnett, when he became Premier, wanted to look at. He's since followed up and tried to roll out stuff under the banner of a thing called the Partnership Forum, where there are 7 Director Generals and 7 Chief Executives from the community sector. I'm on that forum. There's a whole new delivering community services in partnership policy which is in place, which is trying to move down a new path in terms of the way that services are delivered. And I'm currently co-chairing a group as part of that, which is trying to create a new culture, and exactly what Kasey talked about, a culture of collaboration and working together between the public sector and the not-for-profit sector on issues from defining community need, developing up program responses. They should be the important things, not competitive tendering and contracting, and we need to be at the table from go to woe.
Well, we've spoken a lot now about the relations with government. Let's get back to Anglicare and its mission, particularly the sorts of things that are being discussed at your conference. Now, I've received from you a huge list of extremely interesting topics that are being talked about. But if you had to set some priorities, and I guess all three of you would have different priorities, but for this conference, what for you are the important things you want to get out and get the people talking about, both for the organisation and for the community generally? Kasey, we'll start with you.
Well, I'm going to go to the theme of the conference. The theme is every voice. Now, usually I'm the kind of person that looks at logos and thinks ho-hum and thinks about themes and thinks, good, we've got our theme now, we can get on with the real work. However, this theme has really captured people. We're really thinking about how we hear voices, how we make sure that we capture the voices of the people who use our services, make sure that they are inputted into the design of services, made absolutely central to how those services occur. And also voices and how we make sure that the voice of those people, the people who have the courage to come to our services to seek to change their lives, how we translate that courage into a voice to policymakers. So to me, that's absolutely integral about this conference. We one of our strategic goals is to influence the social and economic policy across Australia, called to speak out for those who are most disadvantaged. So clearly we've put this at the centre of this conference, the vast array of workshops, as you say, John, and we're very surprised you're not here, to be honest. We thought, send you the handbook, it was bound to get you down here. But certainly they have all responded to that theme about how we make sure that we put the people we serve absolutely centre of the services.
And Ian, what for you are the big priorities? Particularly in regard to the conference.
Yep. Certainly the one that we started this whole conversation on. We had a fantastic conversation today between chief executives, bishops and board members about the whole issue about the Anglicares and their relationship with the Anglican Church, and it was a fantastic conversation, and there's a lot more for us to do, and that was very useful. But in terms of the rest of the conference, this whole focus on outcomes, evidence and research is a huge part of our evolving network, and we've got a whole range of presentations and submissions around work in that area. The issue of Aboriginal reconciliation is an evolving and strong theme within Anglicares right around the country. And then the other thing for, I think, the Anglicares, and you see it almost implicit in what we do, is we're getting better and better at building capacity between each other one agency develops high-level capability in mental health and self-directed services, and they then share that across the Anglicare Australia network across the country. We've got more work to do on that, and we're starting that journey even further during this conference. But that kind of work is also critical to our future.
And Peter, we can't leave you aside here.
Well, look, you could really, because they both said exactly what I was going to say. But I guess one of the things that I always find about these conferences, and I've actually been to many of them.
12, I think you've been to.
I attended the very first of these before it became Anglicare Australia. It was known as the National Anglican Welfare Conference, held at Gilbulla in New South Wales in 1983, and I was a mere youth at the time. But look, one of the things I really appreciate about the Anglicare Australia network and this conference is how comprehensive the work is. It really is from the cradle to the grave and all the fun of life in between. There are so many different topics and different areas. Kasey and Ian have mentioned some of them, but homelessness, disability, mental health. And I think one of the things that's also good and is emerging as the years go is really trying to integrate this into a theological a theology of the practice, an understanding of what it means to be church in community. So I'm very excited by that. It's going to be a good conference.
And if I can have one more bite at that cherry too. Certainly the whole area of community and fellowship within the network is huge. It's we have about 230 people attending. And by the end of tomorrow, it's like one big family. We have about a third of those people are usually newcomers, but not everybody comes every year. So there's a great sense of people catching back up on each other and building those relationships, which then, as Ian said, go on to build bigger and better things. And there's a sense for me each year that the whole becomes bigger and bigger and bigger than the sum of the parts of the network each year as we go on.
And we are present, John, in so many communities around the country. The over 40 agencies, when you actually start sticking the dots on the map of Australia, my organisation's got huge operations in the Kimberley and right down in the Great Southern and in between. That's replicated right across this country, and where the number of communities we're in is significant, and that's a real add value to the work that we do.
Let me take just one example, and you might care to outline how that's played out in different agencies. The vexed issue that we touched on briefly at the very start, the way the church has a problem with image, not the least through all the stories on child abuse, and we've had the Newcastle Diocese, particularly in the last week or so. You've got a session on child and family advocacy, improving outcomes for children and young people who have experienced abuse. But as you just indicated, you range in things from the Kimberley and, say, Central Australia, where Aboriginal child abuse is quite different to child abuse in some ways that occurs in domestic environments in the city or in urban areas. I mean, just a topic like that seems to be almost overwhelming.
It is, and as you say, there's lots of different elements to issues around child abuse and the horrors of how that's happened in the past, and the continuing presence tragically in our community. Child sexual abuse treatment services is part of my agency, and we do a lot of work in the Kimberley as well as in the Perth metropolitan area. But then other forms of it, and that's what this workshop's going to be talking about, other forms of our work include traditional work around child protection, foster care, out-of-home care in all of its different forms. The Anglicare Victoria, Anglicare Diocese of Sydney are all big players in that kind of work around this country. And that's that issue about building the capacity in terms of that work. We want to try and get those people together more, sharing their experiences. And because we're like brother and sister agencies, the capacity to share and grow that capacity quickly and easily is significantly enhanced. And having, a lean operation in Canberra run by Kasey, she facilitates and oils the wheels in terms of making that happen.
And this actually underscores the nature of Anglicare organisations as organisations that began by innovating, by starting something new. And whilst we are substantially government funded, the reality is that a lot of the things that we do when we come in conference together is to look at some new things that we're doing, look at the ways we can adapt and change the society, and in a sense be changed by the society as the problems emerge and the different ways of responding emerge. And so innovation is a really key part of what we do together.
How would Anglicare, and we've only got a couple of minutes left, and perhaps this is a good example of responding to a particular social issue as it arises that's not necessarily program-based but is significant for the community, and that's the recent controversy, it still goes on, over pokies and the damage that gambling does in the community. How's Anglicare connected to those sorts of debates, Kasey?
Connected on every level, actually. So many of our agencies work with people with gambling issues. Many of them through gambling and anti-gambling programs. Many just through turning up through emergency relief. We're also involved with it at a policy level. We have had a interchurch and agency task force across all the churches, and we have been working closely with the government through that to try to limit the damage that we see, particularly pokies doing to actually the poorest people in the community generally.
When you're lined up against the power of the clubs industry,
Yep.
It almost seems that local action, even if every member of every parish went round with a little badge or a little credit card saying this is the damage that pokies do, so it still seems a sort of mosquito against an elephant.
Well, one of our we have 5 shared values, and one of them, and perhaps for me the most fundamental, is hope. And we can remain optimistic and hope that we can keep on making these differences, and that people will see the changes here. There was a time not so long ago when people used to smoke in offices, when it was okay to drink during work hours. All these things are now found socially unacceptable, and I do think that there'll be a time when the kind of advertising that's being driven around pokies will become unacceptable, and we live in hope of that one.
And just briefly, we've got 30 seconds left. What are the outcomes you hope from the conference? Kasey first, and perhaps briefly from Ian and Peter.
Well, certainly some food for thought for us as a national office, some guidance as to where we're going for the next little while in terms of those issues, some work back into those networks, some new friends, and lots of dancing.
And from me, the issue about the balance between high-quality service delivery and continuing strong advocacy in our community.
And Peter, finally.
And for me, being able to draw more people into the network and to help people to see the vision and to share in it, because Anglicare, we talk about Anglicare Australia as being in every community, and we need to do that as strongly as we possibly can.
This has been a podcast of Sunday Nights on ABC Local Radio. Thank you for listening.